During the funeral, the mother opened her son's casket. What happened next made everyone scream. Hello, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment on what you think is going to happen. Let's see if you can guess correctly. Write your prediction below, and I'll give you the answer at the end. The sky was a heavy blanket of gray as mourners gathered around the open grave. Raindrops fell lightly, blending with the tears on the faces of those who had come to say their final goodbye. In the center of it all stood Maria, her face pale, eyes hollow, clinging to the arm of her sister for support. The loss of her only son, Daniel, had broken something deep inside her. As she stood there, watching the coffin being lowered into the earth, an overwhelming sense of disbelief washed over her. How could he be gone? Her heart, already shattered, couldn't comprehend the reality. The air was thick with sorrow, and an unsettling tension hung over the crowd, as though everyone could feel that something wasn't quite right. As the priest recited the final prayers, Maria's gaze was drawn to the coffin. The polish would seem too cold, too final. She remembered Daniel's smile, the warmth in his eyes, and the way he used to fill every room with light. Now, all that remained of him was inside that box. The thought was unbearable. Her grip on her sister's arm tightened. There had been rumors, whispers among some of the mourners, suggesting that Daniel's death wasn't as it seemed. But Maria had dismissed them. Grief played tricks on the mind, she thought. Yet, standing there, something gnawed at her. What if those whispers were true? What if Daniel wasn't at peace? Suddenly, driven by a force she couldn't explain, Maria stepped forward. Gasps echoed through the small crowd as she approached the coffin. Her hands trembled, but she felt an undeniable pull. Her sister called out to her, but Maria couldn't stop. The world seemed to slow as she reached the coffin, her fingers grazing the edge of the lid. "I need to see him," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Before anyone could react, she flung the lid open. What lay before her was something that none of them could have expected. A collective scream tore through the mourners, as what they saw inside the coffin wasn't the still, peaceful body of Daniel. Instead, there was movement, subtle but unmistakable. Daniel's chest rose and fell, shallow breaths barely visible beneath his suit. His eyes, closed only moments before, flickered open, dull and unfocused. Chaos erupted. Some of the mourners fainted. Others rushed to pull Maria away from the coffin. But she was frozen, locked in place, unable to tear her eyes away from her son. How was this possible? Her mind raced, searching for answers, but all she could do was stand there, staring at the impossible sight before her. Daniel was alive, or something close to it, and whatever had happened to him was far from natural. The crowd erupted into chaos as Maria stood motionless by the open coffin. People were shouting, some trying to run, others frozen in disbelief. The funeral director, wide-eyed and pale, rushed forward to close the lid, but Maria held her hand out, stopping him. Her son, her Daniel, was breathing, his chest moving ever so slightly. But something about him was deeply wrong. His skin was an unnatural shade of gray, and his once bright, expressive eyes were now clouded and vacant. Maria's heart pounded in her chest, torn between overwhelming joy and a creeping terror she couldn't shake. "Daniel!" she whispered, reaching out to touch his cold, clammy hand. As her fingers brushed against his skin, Daniel's eyes fluttered open fully, but there was no recognition in them. His lips moved, barely parting, as if struggling to form words. The priest, visibly shaken, tried to calm the panicking mourners, but his voice trembled. This is not possible," he muttered under his breath, his hands trembling as he clutched his rosary tighter. Daniel's lips finally moved enough to let out a sound, but it wasn't a voice Maria recognized. It was more of a low, guttural whisper, barely audible but sending chills down the spine of everyone who heard it. "Help me," he rasped, though it was unclear if it was a plea or something more sinister. Maria was torn between the maternal instinct to help her son and the overwhelming fear that this wasn't her Daniel. Something unnatural had happened. Her sister, standing behind her, pulled at Maria's arm. "Maria, please step back," she pleaded, her voice filled with fear. But Maria couldn't. This was her son, and even in this terrifying state, she couldn't abandon him. "He needs me," she murmured, though deep down, a part of her was afraid of what might come next. She leaned in closer, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "I'm here, Daniel. I'm here." Suddenly, Daniel's body jerked violently, his back arching as if some invisible force was pulling him upwards. The crowd gasped, some backing away in terror. His breathing became labored, his eyes rolling back into his head. "Something is wrong," a voice shouted from the crowd. The priest stepped forward, holding up his cross, muttering prayers under his breath, his voice shaking with fear. Maria backed away, her heart hammering in her chest, as Daniel's body twisted unnaturally in the coffin. His hand reached out, grasping the edge of the coffin with an unnatural strength. "Help me," he repeated, but this time, the words were filled with desperation, a deep agony that cut through the air like a knife. The tension escalated as people screamed and scattered, unsure whether they were witnessing a miracle or a nightmare. The priest's prayers grew louder, but Daniel's movements became more violent, thrashing against the confines of the coffin. Maria, her body shaking, stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. This was no longer her son. It was something far darker, something that should never have been awakened. And as Daniel's body contorted unnaturally one last time, his eyes locked onto Maria's, and for a brief moment, a flicker of recognition flashed across his face. Then, with a final, ear-piercing scream, everything fell silent. Daniel's body went limp, collapsing back into the coffin, leaving the mourners in a stunned, horrified silence. For what felt like an eternity, the cemetery was frozen in silence. No one dared to move, as if the very air had turned to stone. Maria stood by the coffin, her legs trembling beneath her as her mind struggled to process what had just occurred. Her son Daniel had come back, if only for a moment. But was it really him? Or something else entirely? The crowd around her had begun to murmur, hushed whispers filled with fear and confusion. "It's not natural," someone muttered. "He was dead. How could he move?" Maria's sister rushed forward, pulling her away from the coffin. "We have to leave, Maria. This isn't right." But Maria couldn't tear her eyes away from the still figure in the coffin. Daniel's body was now motionless, his face peaceful as if he had never moved at all. It was as though the violent, terrifying moment had been a figment of everyone's imagination. But the truth was undeniable. Everyone had seen it. The mourners slowly began to back away, some crossing themselves, others whispering prayers, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The priest, who had fallen to his knees in shock, finally rose, his face ashen. "This is an abomination," he declared, his voice shaky. "We must leave this place at once. There is something evil here." Despite the fear gnawing at her insides, Maria stepped closer to the coffin again, her hands trembling. "He's my son," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. But even as she said the words, doubt crept into her mind. Was that really her son in there? Or had something darker taken his place? She bent down, brushing the hair from Daniel's forehead, half expecting him to move again, but he remained perfectly still. Her heart ached with the unbearable weight of loss and confusion. The whispers around her grew louder as people began to disperse, unwilling to stay any longer in the presence of what felt like an unnatural force. Yet Maria couldn't leave. Not like this. Not without understanding what had truly happened. Suddenly, a voice broke through the murmur of the crowd. "This isn't over." It came from an elderly man standing at the edge of the crowd, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Maria's. "Your son's soul is trapped between worlds," he said, his voice filled with a gravity that sent a chill down Maria's spine. "There is something you need to know, something about the day he died. What you saw today was only the beginning." The man's words hung in the air, leaving Maria frozen with fear and curiosity. What could he mean? And what terrible truth was still hidden from her? The crowd had mostly dispersed, but Maria remained, staring blankly at the coffin. The elderly man with the wide-brimmed hat moved closer, his presence commanding attention despite his quiet demeanor. "You should not have opened that coffin," he began, his voice grave. "There are forces in this world that should never be tampered with." Maria turned to him, her face pale, her voice trembling with desperation. "What do you know about my son? What did I just see?" The man's eyes softened, but there was a deep sorrow in them. Daniel's death was not a simple accident, he said slowly, his words deliberate. There is something far more sinister at play. Maria felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the nightmare that had unfolded before her. The whispers, the rumors about Daniel's death that she had ignored, were they true? "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man looked around cautiously, ensuring no one else was listening. Daniel didn't die naturally. His soul was taken before its time, and now it lingers between this world and the next, searching for peace but unable to find it. That is why you saw him move today. His body may be dead, but his soul is trapped. The weight of the man's words pressed down on Maria like a suffocating blanket. She had heard of such things in old folk tales, but she had never believed in them until now. Her heart raced as a terrifying thought gripped her. Who did this to him?" she stammered, her eyes wide with fear. The man shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know, but there are forces that seek to use his soul for dark purposes. If you want to save him, you must act quickly. There is little time left before he is lost forever." The air around them seemed to grow colder, and Maria's mind swirled with questions she couldn't yet articulate. "What do I have to do?" she asked, her voice breaking with emotion. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn book. "There is a ritual," he explained, flipping through the yellowed pages. "It's dangerous, and it will take you to the brink of life and death. But if you succeed, you can free Daniel's soul and bring him peace." Maria's hands trembled as she took the book, her eyes scanning the strange symbols and ancient text. "Why me?" she whispered, the weight of the task bearing down on her. The man gave her a long, solemn look. "Because only a mother's love is strong enough to defy death itself." Maria stood alone in her kitchen that night, the small, worn book resting on the table before her. The man's words echoed in her mind. Only a mother's love is strong enough to defy death itself. She had spent the entire day trying to make sense of the encounter at the cemetery, but the more she thought about it, the more real it felt. The memory of Daniel's eyes flickering open, his raspy plea for help, haunted her. Could she really go through with this? Could she risk her own life to save him? But the alternative, leaving his soul to suffer in some unknown realm, was unbearable. The pages of the book were filled with symbols and instructions, written in a language Maria didn't fully understand. But as she flipped through it, certain words seemed to glow faintly, their meaning somehow becoming clear in her mind. There was a ritual, a dangerous one, that would allow her to reach beyond the veil of death and call to Daniel's soul. It required items that were both strange and familiar. A lock of his hair, something of sentimental value from his childhood, and something that connected them both. Maria's hands shook as she gathered the items, the weight of what she was about to do pressing heavily on her heart. Was this madness? Or was it the only way to save her son? By midnight, Maria was ready. She had set up the ritual as instructed, the items carefully placed in a circle on the cold, hard floor. The air in the room felt thick, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls, making the house feel both familiar and foreign at the same time. She knelt at the center of the circle, clutching a small toy car Daniel used to play with when he was a child. Her mind raced, filled with memories of his laughter, his first steps, and the way he would run into her arms. Now, the thought of him suffering in some liminal space between life and death tore at her soul. She had to do this. There was no turning back. Maria closed her eyes, whispering the words from the book, her voice trembling as she recited the strange incantation. The room grew colder, the temperature plummeting until she could see her breath in the dim light. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. But then, slowly, a low, almost imperceptible hum began to fill the room. It grew louder, more intense, until it became a deafening roar that made her clutch her head in pain. The candles flickered violently, and suddenly, the air around her seemed to rip apart. A cold, otherworldly presence filled the space, and Maria's eyes flew open. There, standing before her, was Daniel, but not as she remembered him. Maria's heart nearly stopped as she looked up and saw the figure before her. It was Daniel, but at the same time, it wasn't. His form was familiar, tall, with the same features she had kissed 1,000 times before. But something was deeply wrong. His skin was an ashen gray, stretched tightly over his bones, and his eyes were hollow black voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. His once warm smile was twisted into a grimace of pain and confusion. This was not the son she had raised. This was a shadow, a fragment of what he had been. A shiver ran down her spine, but Maria forced herself to stay where she was. She couldn't turn back now. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her throat dry with fear. The figure tilted its head, as if struggling to understand the sound of her voice. It took a step forward, moving awkwardly, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Maria's instincts screamed at her to run, but she stood her ground, her hands trembling at her sides. "Daniel, it's me, Mom," she said again, louder this time. The figure stopped, its head snapping toward her, those black, empty eyes locking onto hers. For a brief moment, a flicker of recognition crossed his face, and Maria's heart leapt with hope. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by something far darker. The room grew colder, the very air around them thick with a heavy, oppressive force. The candles flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Daniel's mouth opened, but the voice that came out was not his own. It was low and guttural, filled with anguish and rage. "Why did you bring me here?" the voice growled, sending chills down Maria's spine. She stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. I wanted to help you," she stammered, her voice trembling. But the figure before her was no longer her son. Whatever part of Daniel had been trapped in the world between life and death was now tainted by something far more sinister. Maria's mind raced as she tried to remember the instructions from the book. There had been warnings, mentions of the dangers of calling forth a soul that was not ready to return. But she had been desperate, blinded by her grief and her love for Daniel. Now, as she faced the twisted form of her son, she realized the gravity of her mistake. This was not just a reunion. This was a battle for his very soul. "You don't belong here," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear and sorrow. "I only wanted to save you." The figure's mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and it took another step toward her. "You can't save me," it hissed, "but you can join me." Maria's blood ran cold as the figure lunged forward, its movements sharp and unnatural. She barely had time to react, scrambling backward as it reached out toward her with skeletal hands. Her mind screamed in terror, but somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance flared. This wasn't Daniel, not truly. And if she didn't do something soon, she would lose him forever. Her eyes darted to the book lying on the floor, its pages glowing faintly in the candlelight. There had to be a way to reverse this, to send him back before it was too late. But time was running out, and the shadow of Daniel was closing in. Maria's hands fumbled as she grabbed the book from the floor, her fingers shaking uncontrollably. The shadow that was once her son loomed over her, its black, empty eyes fixated on her with an unnatural hunger. She could feel the cold emanating from him, a chill that cut straight to her bones. Flipping frantically through the yellowed pages, Maria searched for something, anything, that could help her undo what she had started. The ritual had brought him back, but it had brought something else with him, something far darker. As the pages blurred before her eyes, she heard the low, guttural growl again, closer this time. She looked up, and the figure was reaching for her. With a cry, Maria instinctively pushed back, stumbling against the table behind her. The book slipped from her hands, falling open to a page near the end, where an old cryptic symbol caught her eye. Desperation surged through her. This was her last chance. Kneeling on the floor, she ran her fingers over the faded ink, trying to steady her breath enough to read the incantation. The words were foreign, unfamiliar, but as she whispered them under her breath, they began to flow from her lips as though she had known them all her life. The air around her seemed to ripple, and the candles flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The figure that had been Daniel recoiled, its head tilting back as if in pain. For the first time since his return, there was hesitation in his movements. Maria saw her chance. "Daniel!" she shouted, her voice trembling but filled with the fierce love only a mother could have. "I know you're still in there. You have to fight. The shadow paused, its twisted form flickering like a flame about to go out. She took a step closer, her heart pounding. "I won't let them take you." Her voice cracked with emotion, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of recognition in his face again. The real Daniel struggling to break free. But the darkness wasn't willing to let go. The figure let out a scream that echoed through the room, a sound so piercing that it seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. It lunged at Maria again, but this time she didn't back down. Clutching the book, she continued to chant the words, louder now, with more conviction. The candles flared, the light growing brighter, pushing the shadow back. The room was filled with a powerful force, a clash between the light Maria had summoned and the darkness that had taken hold of her son. The figure writhed in agony, its shape distorting as if it was being torn apart from within. Maria's heart raced as she watched, her voice unwavering despite the terror that gripped her. She could feel the presence of Daniel, the real Daniel, fighting to reach her. "Come back to me!" she cried out, tears streaming down her face. The figure shrieked, its form dissolving into a swirling mist of darkness. For a brief, terrifying moment, the room was engulfed in shadows. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness receded, sucked back into the void from which it came. The air fell still. The candles dimmed to a soft glow. And there, lying on the floor, was Daniel, his body motionless but at peace, the torment in his expression gone. The silence in the room was deafening. Maria stood frozen, staring at Daniel's lifeless body lying on the floor. The shadows that had tormented them both were gone, but the cold emptiness they left behind lingered in the air. She dropped the book from her hands, its pages fluttering shut as it hit the ground. Slowly, she approached Daniel, her heart pounding with both fear and hope. Kneeling beside him, she gently placed her hand on his chest, praying for the rise and fall of breath. But there was nothing. His skin, once warm with life, was cold beneath her fingertips. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized the truth. Her son was gone. For what felt like hours, Maria stayed beside Daniel, cradling his head in her lap as she wept. She had fought so hard to bring him back, to save him from the darkness that had stolen him away. But now all that remained was his body, free from torment, but also free from life. The room was still, the flickering candles casting faint shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, a reminder that the world was moving on, even as hers stood still. Maria had no words left, only the overwhelming grief of a mother who had lost her child twice. Suddenly, the quiet was broken by a soft knock at the door. Maria lifted her head, her tear-filled eyes staring at the entrance. She didn't move, didn't speak. The knock came again, louder this time. With a heavy heart, she rose from the floor, leaving Daniel's body behind as she made her way to the door. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob, unsure if she was ready to face whatever awaited her on the other side. When she finally opened it, she found the elderly man from the cemetery standing there, his face lined with sorrow. "It's over," he said gently, his voice filled with the weight of years of experience. "You did all you could." Maria stepped back, allowing him inside. He looked around the room, his eyes settling on Daniel's body. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply watching the scene unfold in front of him. Then, with a deep sigh, he knelt beside the boy, placing a hand on his forehead. "He's at peace now," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. Maria's heart clenched, the words offering little comfort in the face of her loss. "I couldn't save him," she said, her voice breaking. The man shook his head slowly. "You saved him from something far worse. His soul was in danger of being consumed by the darkness, but now he is free. You gave him that freedom." Maria wanted to believe him, but the emptiness in her heart was too great. She sank into a chair, her body trembling with exhaustion. The man stood, his eyes filled with a deep understanding of her pain. "There are some things we cannot change, no matter how much we wish we could," he said softly. "But know this, Daniel's spirit is free. And in time, you will see him again, in a place where darkness cannot follow." Maria closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. She wanted to believe in that promise, to find solace in the idea that one day, she would be reunited with her son. But for now, All she could feel was the overwhelming weight of her loss. Days passed, but to Maria, time had lost all meaning. The house was quiet now, eerily so, as though the walls themselves were mourning the loss of Daniel. Every corner reminded her of him. The kitchen where he used to sneak cookies before dinner. The living room where he played with his toys, his laughter echoing through the halls. Now there was only silence. The rituals had stopped, the shadows had vanished, and all that was left was the emptiness inside her. Maria wandered the house aimlessly, her grief like a heavy fog that never lifted. The ache in her chest was constant, a dull throb that refused to go away. Each night, Maria found herself drawn back to Daniel's room. She would sit on his bed, running her fingers over the worn blanket he had used since childhood. The faint scent of him still lingered in the fabric, and for a moment, she could almost pretend he was just out of sight, waiting to come back home. But the reality was inescapable. Her son was gone. She had done everything in her power to save him, even risking her own soul to bring him back. But in the end, she had failed. The darkness had claimed him, and though she had fought it off, Daniel's life had slipped through her fingers like sand. The elderly man had come by once more, offering his condolences and reassurances that Daniel was at peace. He had spoken of the realms beyond, of how Daniel's spirit had been freed from the grip of the malevolent force that had sought to take him. But those words felt hollow to Maria. She had held Daniel's lifeless body in her arms, watched as the life drained from him not once, but twice. The promises of an afterlife did little to comfort the raw, searing pain of a mother who had lost her child. Every night she prayed for a sign, for some indication that Daniel was still out there, somewhere watching over her. But the silence was deafening. As the days bled into weeks, Maria became consumed by her grief. She stopped answering the phone, stopped visiting the few friends who had remained by her side after Daniel's death. They didn't understand the depth of her sorrow, couldn't comprehend the magnitude of what she had been through. The supernatural encounter with her son had been too much for her to bear, and she knew that no one could truly understand the darkness she had faced. The memories haunted her. Daniel's twisted form, the cold, lifeless look in his eyes, the guttural voice that had called out to her. It played over and over in her mind, a nightmare she couldn't escape. One evening, as Maria sat by the window, watching the sun set over the horizon, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. It wasn't peace, not entirely, but it was as though the weight on her chest had lifted, just for a moment. She closed her eyes, letting the soft breeze from the open window brush against her skin. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to cry, not out of despair, but out of the deep, aching love she still held for her son. In her heart, she knew that Daniel would never truly be gone. He would always be a part of her, no matter where his spirit had gone. And in that quiet, fleeting moment, Maria found a sliver of solace. The days grew colder as autumn settled over the town, and with the changing of the seasons, Maria found herself slowly coming to terms with her grief. The raw edges of her pain had dulled, though they would never fully disappear. There were still moments when the loss of Daniel hit her like a wave, knocking the breath from her lungs. But in those moments, she would close her eyes and remind herself of the love she had shared with her son, of the bond that even death couldn't sever. It wasn't peace, not entirely, but it was something, a fragile acceptance of the tragedy that had changed her life forever. One afternoon, as she was tidying up Daniel's room, Maria found something she hadn't seen in years. A small, hand-drawn card from Daniel, given to her on one of her birthdays when he was just a child. The crayon was smudged and the paper worn with age, but the message was clear. "I love you, Mommy. Always and forever." Maria's heart clenched as she held the card in her hands, tears spilling down her cheeks. The simple, childlike words were a reminder of the love that had always been between them, a love that death couldn't take away. In that moment, she felt Daniel's presence more strongly than she had since his passing. That night, Maria had a dream, one that felt different from the restless nightmares that had plagued her in the weeks after Daniel's death. In this dream, she was standing in a field of golden wheat, the sun warm on her face. The sky was a brilliant shade of blue, and there in the distance she saw Daniel. He was smiling, his face lit up with the same joy she remembered from when he was young. He ran toward her, his laughter filling the air, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Maria felt light, like the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders. She knelt down as he reached her, pulling him into her arms. "Mom," he said softly, his voice clear and bright, just as it had been before everything had gone wrong. "I'm okay." Maria held him tightly, afraid to let go, afraid that if she did, he would disappear again. But Daniel pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes with a calmness that soothed her soul. "You don't have to worry about me anymore," he continued, his small hands cupping her face. "I'm free now. I'm happy." Tears streamed down Maria's face, but they weren't tears of sadness this time. They were tears of relief, of love, of knowing that her son was finally at peace. "I love you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I love you too," Daniel said with a smile, stepping back. "Always and forever." As he turned and began to walk away, Maria wanted to call after him, to tell him to stay. But something inside her knew that this was the goodbye they both needed. She watched as he faded into the distance, the sun setting behind him, casting a golden glow over the field. When she woke the next morning, the grief that had clung to her for so long felt lighter, as though Daniel had taken a piece of it with him when he left. Maria knew that she would never stop missing him, but now, for the first time, she felt like she could move forward. In the weeks that followed the dream, Maria found herself gradually returning to the rhythms of everyday life. It was not easy, and there were days when the sorrow still clung to her like a shadow, but the weight was lighter now. She had begun to accept that Daniel was gone from this world, but he would always be with her in spirit. The mornings felt different. She no longer dreaded waking up to an empty house. Instead, she found solace in the little things. Watering the plants Daniel had once helped her with, cooking his favorite meals, and visiting the places they had shared memories together. These simple acts became her way of honoring him. One day, as she was organizing old family photos, Maria came across an album she hadn't opened in years. Inside were snapshots of Daniel's childhood, his first day of school, his soccer games, birthdays, and holidays. Each photo was a reminder of the joyful moments they had shared, and as Maria flipped through the pages, she felt a bittersweet warmth spread through her. The memories didn't hurt as much as they once had. Instead, they reminded her of the love and happiness that Daniel had brought into her life. For the first time in months, Maria allowed herself to smile as she remembered her son, not with pain, but with gratitude. As autumn turned to winter, Maria decided it was time to make a change. The house, once filled with Daniel's laughter, now felt too big, too empty for just her. She began packing up some of his belongings, carefully placing his favorite toys and clothes into boxes. Each item she touched brought back a flood of memories, but instead of breaking her heart, it gave her peace. She knew that holding on to these things wouldn't bring Daniel back, and it was time for her to let go, not of the love she had for him, but of the physical reminders that kept her trapped in the past. It was time to move forward, just as Daniel would have wanted her to. On a crisp winter morning, Maria visited Daniel's grave for the first time since the day of the funeral. She brought with her the small card he had made for her all those years ago, the one that said, "I love you, Mommy, always and forever." Kneeling beside his headstone, Maria placed the card gently on the ground, her fingers tracing the words carved into the stone. "I miss you every day," she whispered, her voice soft and filled with emotion. "But I know you're at peace now." The wind blew softly through the trees, and for a moment, Maria could have sworn she felt Daniel's presence beside her, comforting her as he always had. She closed her eyes, letting the moment wash over her, and when she stood up to leave, she felt lighter, as though a piece of her heart had healed. The seasons continued to change, and with them, Maria found herself changing too. The once unbearable grief that had overshadowed her life was now a quiet companion, a reminder of the love she had shared with Daniel, but no longer the overwhelming force it had been. She had learned to live with the loss, carrying it with her, but allowing herself to grow beyond it. Each day felt like a small step toward healing, and though the pain of losing Daniel would never fully fade, Maria had found ways to honor his memory without being consumed by it. She had begun volunteering at a local community center, helping children with after-school activities, something Daniel would have loved. The center had become a place of comfort for Maria, a place where she could share her nurturing spirit and feel a sense of purpose once again. The children there reminded her of Daniel in so many ways. Their curiosity, their laughter, their boundless energy. It was both painful and healing to be around them, but over time, the healing won out. Maria found joy in their company, in knowing she could make a difference in their lives, just as Daniel had made a difference in hers. The days no longer felt as empty, and for the first time in a long while, Maria felt like she was part of something meaningful again. One afternoon, as she was helping a young boy with his homework, the child looked up at her and said, "You remind me of my mom. She always makes me feel better when I'm sad." The comment caught Maria off guard, and she had to blink away the tears that formed in her eyes. She smiled softly, patting the boy's shoulder. "That's what moms are for," she said, her voice warm with affection. The boy's innocent words stayed with her long after the day was done, reminding her of the special bond she had shared with Daniel. Being here, helping these children, was her way of continuing that bond, of being the nurturing, loving figure she had always been for her son. As winter gave way to spring, Maria made a decision that had been quietly growing in her heart. She would sell the house. The home she had shared with Daniel was filled with beautiful memories, but it also held her back, tying her to the past in ways that prevented her from fully moving forward. It was time for a fresh start, time to build a new life in a place that wasn't haunted by the weight of loss. With the help of a realtor, Maria began the process of finding a new place to live, a small, cozy apartment in a part of town she had always loved. It was bittersweet, leaving behind the place where so much of her life with Daniel had unfolded, but she knew it was the right choice. On the day she moved out, Maria took one last walk through the house, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. She paused in Daniel's bedroom, where the sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a soft, golden glow over the space. "Goodbye," she whispered, her voice steady and filled with love. It wasn't just a goodbye to the house. It was a goodbye to the chapter of her life that had been defined by grief. As she closed the door behind her, Maria felt a sense of peace wash over her. She wasn't forgetting Daniel, she never would, but she was ready to embrace the future, carrying his memory with her as she moved forward into the next phase of her life. If you like this story and want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And now, you have a new video appearing on the screen, full of unexpected twists and touching moments. Click on it and get ready for another inspiring story.